Okay, so over this series, if you haven't been to any of the previous ones, you know that what I've been trying to do is to focus on broader aspects of life which our ancestors would have been likely to encounter, with the idea that in order for us to really understand and to a certain extent to find out more about our ancestors, we need to look more broadly. And so in the lectures so far, where I've talked about work, religion, and crime, these are all kind of fairly obvious contexts in which we would expect our ancestors of the past to have had some kind of experience. And if you're looking at the perspective of today, what are the defining experiences of us as individuals? What are the most frequent experiences that we would have? Well, probably we would say shopping would be a huge aspect of our lives. The whole issue of consumption and the purchase of manufactured goods. It dominates society, and all of the marketing, the advertising, the retailing that goes along with it. And so I thought it would be really interesting, because that must have been an experience that our ancestors in the past would have had. So I thought it would be really interesting to look at this aspect of family history. But of course, as I started to do the research, I discovered that interest in shopping as a cultural experience is really a very recent phenomenon, and historians have only really started to look at the way in which shopping has emerged as a modern concept. And so, for example, and really that research has been largely confined to England, in that there's been a bit of work looking at late 19th, early 20th century shop layouts, the development of the department store, and the emergence of early marketing strategies and tactics within retail environments. And we can sort of see that interest appearing in the popular media, right? With the popularity of recent sort of department store and hotel costume dramas like Selfridges and things. And so you can see how there's a growing interest then around this subject. But nothing has been done for Ireland along that line. So Robinson and Cleaver, or Anderson and Macaulay, they still await a proper and full historical treatment. So much of the research really that's been done into shopping has really looked at it from an economic perspective, as an economic process. And so the concentration and the focus is really on the notion of commercialization, the emergence of a retail trade, and the impact that that has then on prices, on credit, on interest rates, and that sort of thing. So it all gets a little bit heavy, really, and I'm not sure particularly interesting. For the most part, even particularly looking at Belfast, I think the contemporary history of Belfast has almost entirely neglected Belfast's commercial sector. There are a few publications that look at baking and some of those, but even those are really looking at an industrial process, looking at it as a factory rather than as a retail process, something that happens in a shop. And so most of the big histories of Belfast mention shopping and shops and retail trade. Not at all. It's not even mentioned. So what we're going to try to do today is to put together the few bits and pieces that I've been able to find to try and get a sense of shops and shopping in Ireland over the course of the 19th and early 20th century. And while it may not help us to find our relatives in the past, for the records aren't quite as conducive to that as others we've looked at in this series, I hope it might help us to set their experiences in a broader context and help us to understand perhaps an environment in which our ancestors would have lived, and if we had family members who had owned businesses, that we would be able to understand the nature of that business a little bit better. So what I'm hoping to do today then is to look a little bit at the definitions and the definitions and the terminology we'll be using. Then looking a bit at some of the sources that you would use for this kind of research. And then I wanted to look at the emergence of the retail sector in 19th century Ireland and what that kind of looked like. And then follow it up with two very small kind of local case studies that I've done, which you could do too, and really probably aren't that difficult, and quite limited, and in terms of time and energy. So let's crack on then. Oh, I've done my introduction already. And so if we're talking about some of the terminology that we're going to be using today, when we talk about shopping, the official term that we're using is the commercial sector. Is that commercial enterprise being enterprise or economic activity that takes place around the sale of goods. And so in this respect, my talk today will exclude and not discuss at all the sale of services. So solicitors don't count, or doctors, or anything like that that's selling a service. For the most part here today, we're really talking about the sale of goods or products of some kind or another. Now, in the early modern period, this notion of the commercial sector is complicated by the fact that production of goods largely takes place by hand, and that therefore you had people who had a craft or a trade or a skill which they would use, and they would in essence be self-employed craftsmen and use their home or their workshop. Their home would then be their workshop as well as their retail space. Okay, so the home or the domestic environment then serves a multiplicity of purposes, if you will. So this notion of the craftsman or the artisan, who's also a sort of a self-employed trader, kind of complicates the commercial environment. And you don't really have, therefore, the existence or the need for an extensive set of purpose-built commercial premises. Right? People can sell products from their workshops, or else they take them to a central market to do that. Okay, but over time, with the onset of mechanization and industrialization, more and more people are getting involved in the sale of goods which they have not made themselves, which they have bought from others. And in this sense, you can see the emergence of the retail sector then, which is divided into retail, which is sale directed towards the general public, or wholesale, which, as we know, is sale to other traders, and generally speaking, sale in bulk. Now, over the course of the 19th century, all of these terms here along the bottom are used to refer to people who are involved in the retail environment. These terms here, dealer and huckster, tend to be more frequent in the pre-famine period, and we'll talk about that in a second. Merchants tends to convey a higher social status and tend to be almost exclusively male throughout the 19th century. But shopkeeper and trader and dealer, to a limited extent, are broad generic terms that are applied to a range of different premises. And can refer to both males and females. So, once we've got a kind of a notion, I wanted to talk just a bit about the kind of sources that you would use in order to explore this kind of history. Now, inevitably, I've put business records first because they're obviously going to be the first port of call. But business records are patchy, and particularly for the type of enterprises that our families were more than likely involved in, they probably haven't survived. Many have been lost, or really are only very, very patchy. I mean, if you heard me talking a couple of weeks ago about business records in an industrial context, you know that the existence of good, solid records for linen industries can be difficult enough to find, let alone for the small corner grocery shop in a working class district in the west of Ireland, say. So business records can be very patchy, and you can see that what economic historians have done is that they have managed to find those few shops for which good records have survived and rely on those and use those as sort of case studies or examples. This means that doing a comprehensive business history is very difficult, if not impossible. So economic historians then need to rely on a range of examples from across the country, acknowledging the problems that there might be in the comparison. Okay, but the other sources are far more widespread. The street directory is then the most obvious next source to use. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the way in which street directories record the different businesses within the respective towns and cities. But another set of records is the census. And as I was saying last week, the printed reports, the top level data for the censuses of Ireland from 1841 are available for free from the website called HistPop, which includes data about occupation of people broken down to, say, parish level, and will include data about different trades and that kind of thing. So there's lots of great information in the census, even which can sometimes get down as close to a parish level, even if it doesn't actually mention a particular family member. There are also a range of government reports that dealt with all sorts of business practices. And the government kind of turned its attention to business practices, particularly in the west of Ireland in the late 19th century, and issued a number of reports at which people gave testimony and evidence. And some of these reports can be quite useful too. Now, I haven't used these myself, but one of the articles I was reading talks about the Crown and Peace records, which contain applications for pub licenses. And I thought that's a kind of an interesting source too, again, if you had a publican in the family. That something like that would be able to be chased up. But apart from the census and the street directory, which are very comfortable and familiar genealogical sources for us, these other sources are a little bit trickier to handle. And accessing them and trying to get a sense of perhaps your very small local shop could be very, very difficult. The one source really which stands out and where shops and shopping are displayed is the photograph. And so I want to talk just for a moment then about photographs and photography in Ireland. Photography itself emerged in the 19th century, around about 1839, when the daguerreotype was first invented. That innovation was quickly followed then by the invention of the calotype, which is in essence the foundation for the notion of the negative, which then drove the rest of photography throughout the rest of the century. Now by 1842, the first photographic studio had opened in Belfast, and it was the second photographic studio on the island of Ireland. Professional photography really took off though from the 1850s. By the 1870s, for example, Belfast had 15 professional photography studios. In the 1880s, you had the invention of Kodak film and the emergence of smaller, more easy to use and more portable cameras. And with it then came the growth of amateur photography. So really, by the 1880s, this is when the photographic record begins to expand dramatically. And unsurprisingly, it's expanding at the same time as interest in towns is growing, and as towns themselves are growing, and all the rest. And so many of the professional photographers who were employed in the north of Ireland in the late 19th century did business, which reveals and shows us what shops and shopping were like. And probably the best example of this is Alexander Hogg, who operated in Belfast from about 1901 to 1939. Now, because the market was already a little saturated by the time he set up his business, he was one of the first photographers to really try and develop a speciality in technical photography. So he was the first person to really start photographing machinery and heavy industry in a serious way. But he also traveled around the country and took photographs of lots of generic subjects like towns and views of various kinds, which could be used in the tourist industry and all the rest. Okay, he did work for architects and solicitors. He did work for the council, for example. So all of the photographs of all of the very poor housing in Belfast, which we're probably quite familiar with, were done by Hogg for the council as part of its program to eliminate slum housing. Okay. And the other photographers like French, Lawrence, and Welch, who were all kind of roughly speaking around about the same time, were doing the same thing. And what this has given us is a massive collection then of town centers, townscapes, streets, which can be unbelievably dull, tedious, and repetitive in terms of their subject matter, but they are inadvertent records, I suppose inadvertent commentators on the shopping experience of our ancestors in the past. And are probably one way of getting very close to your ancestors, because it's hard to imagine really that there's almost a street in Belfast that isn't close to a photograph. So I thought I would just give you a sense of this photographic collection, if you will. And most of these photographs I've taken from one of the two major online collections of digitized photographs, which again you can access, one of which is at the Ulster Museum, and the other is in the National Library of Ireland. But both of them, you can search the catalogs online very, very easily. Okay, so I think, and again, we're looking at these photographs not so much as like it's a, for a distinguishing feature, but you're looking at them in order to understand or get a sense of the shopping experience or the retail experience. So so this is the 1890s, but still reflecting a very traditional way of selling goods, which had largely died out, but was still obviously taking place in some small rural locations. Again, the emergence of the shop front, of gilt lettering, the custom of naming your shop after your family name. Okay, the ubiquitous awning, okay, across the top. Again, the idea of the cluttery shop, the idea of the shop which sells a little bit of everything. And then I wanted to show a couple of photographs of Belfast so that we could get a sense of Belfast as a shopping city. And again, you can see how the streets are nice and broad, good wide footpaths, lots of awnings, a real sense of occasion if you lived in the country to come into the city to do this kind of shopping. And see how, and really how busy the street was. This is the High Street, which was really more important shopping street than Royal Avenue in the 19th century. But how in small towns, the shopping experience was far less glamorous. And the shops would have been commensurately smaller. So the photographic archives are at the Ulster Museum and at the National Library of Ireland. I'm sorry, I meant to put the web addresses on, but you could easily just find them by Googling the titles. And the collections are really fantastic. And I think you can almost come very close to finding a photograph for somebody in your family who has lived on the street. So what I want to do now is I want to talk a bit about the growth and the emergence of retail in Ireland in the 19th century. And so it's really, historians have really kind of framed it in terms of pre-famine and post-famine. And so let's just have a look then at the pre-famine shopping experience. Because although because the retail sector in pre-famine Ireland was really quite small scale. In 1831, only about 7,000 men were identified in the census as being shopkeepers. A fairly small number. And as Cormac O'Grada points out, for the majority of the population, their retail experience would have been based around a more informal and transient arrangement. So far more prevalent in the Irish countryside than the shopkeeper with a fixed premise was in fact the huckster or the dealer, the traveling salesman who would set up on a village green or hawk their wares through the streets or through the streets of the town or through small villages. Hucksters and dealers greatly outnumbered shopkeepers in pre-famine Ireland. The 1841 census reveals that there were 27,000 people who returned themselves as hucksters, as opposed to only 18,000 shopkeepers. And if you look then at Cork in 1841, you can see the statistics that reveal that hucksters and dealers sitting in and around 400 greatly outweigh the number of shopkeepers at 212. But of course, what's interesting too is the extent to which women outnumber men in these trades, whereas in the merchant class, of those, 188 are all men. So you can see how women tend to occupy what is clearly considered to be a retail experience for the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. Cormac O'Grada, pardon me, Cormac O'Grada also includes in his account a quote from Pre-Famine Limerick, which I think is really illustrative of what this retail experience would have been like in the pre-famine period. So this quote refers to Limerick. "To return to the apple woman, legions of ladies were employed through the town upon that traffic. There were really thousands of them, clustering upon the bridges, squatting down in doorways and vacant sheds for temporary markets, marching and crying their sour goods in all the crowded lanes of the city. After you get out of the main street, the handsome part of the town is at an end, and you suddenly find yourself in such a labyrinth of busy swarming poverty and squalid commerce as never was seen. No, not in St. Giles, where Jew and Irishman side by side exhibit their genius for dirt. Here every house almost was a half ruin and swarming with people. In the cellars you looked down and saw a barrel of herrings, which a merchant was dispensing, or a sack of meal, which a poor dirty woman sold to people poorer and dirtier than herself. Above was a tinsman or a shoemaker or other craftsman, his battered ensign at the door, and his small wares peering through the cracked panes of his shop." So you really get a sense that of the individualism of business at this time, and the fact that there was less control or mediation of it through a shop premises. And people would simply set up and stand in the street and try and sell that way. And while today that might embarrass us or make us uncomfortable, there was none of that back then. Now, sure enough, there was this chaos, this commercial chaos. But as Louis Cullen points out, there was a substantial market among the better off. And his argument is that the farming community in Ireland, the middling farmers, the farmers with reasonable holdings and a reasonable degree of wealth, showed signs of an improved standard of living in this period. There was a trend towards better farmhouses, and these farmers displayed a greater disposable income. And some of this can be seen in the growing purchase of luxury goods like tea and tobacco. Tea in particular, as a luxury commodity, increases dramatically in terms of its consumption. Imports had risen significantly since the 1800s, doubling by the 1820s. And so in this respect then, we can see how the growing availability of cash in the economy means that there's people with money to spend, and therefore those who will try and meet that demand. Now let's have a look then at sort of what happens sort of in the post-famine era. And I want to focus first of all on shops in the rural areas. In that, again, if we discount the laboring class who were deeply affected by the famine, as we all know, and focus instead on the farming community, once again we see a community which was largely unaffected by the famine, and if anything actually did very well out of it. Holdings consolidated, grew larger. There was again a rising standard of living for many within these sorts of middling classes. And there was a growing rural prosperity, which was evidenced despite some serious depressions in rising prices and the growing commercialization of rural life. Historians point in particular to the fact that people were depositing more and more money in banks, so that the number of banks starts to grow, and those banks then have more money to look after. Historians also point to the development of communication networks, the development of better roads. The growth in particular of the railway had a massive impact. So again, if we look at the railway's trajectory, the first track of rail is laid in Ireland in 1839. The real boom in rail building takes place around 1844 to the early 1850s. And by 1866, Ireland's 19th century railway network is pretty much established. And again, the railway, with its ability to move goods more cheaply, to connect far distant markets to rural areas, fueled then a commercial revolution. And so in rural areas and even very remote areas, the number of shops begins to increase. You see the growing consumption of luxury goods, or goods that aren't local or indigenous to rural areas. And again, historians point to the growing consumption of yellow meal as an alternative to potatoes. That the consumption of tea and tobacco continues to increase, so that by the 1870s, the Irish are consuming roughly the same amount of tea and tobacco as the English are. Okay, and we would use then as an indicator then of affluence or prosperity. Towns in rural areas then also grew and had an enhanced commercial role. They became regional wholesaling centers and began to compete with the big traditional wholesalers who had been based in port cities like Belfast, Dublin, and Cork. So now if you've got more and more small villages with a small shop, it would be handier for them to use their local market town as their wholesale depot rather than having to trail all the way back to the big city. And so in this respect, this is all a good development. This is all driving a greater diversity in jobs and employment, and is good for the commercial sector. But what this all meant, of course, was the demise of rural industry, the demise of what was called localism, the production of goods for local consumption. And in particular, I'm thinking of the rural crafts and industries such as shoemaking or breweries or tanneries, particularly blacksmiths as well, and the production of ironmongery. The invention of the sewing machine the invention of mechanized way of producing nails, the easy transport of London-produced hats, all had a knock-on effect on local craft production. But this doesn't happen immediately. It really kicks off around about the 1870s. And after that, then, there's a real industrial crisis. And many towns in rural Ireland, apart from Belfast, experience a terrible crisis, a loss of industry, a reduction in their industrial production. But what's also happening then is the emergence of the publican grocer, the very sort of standard rural shop, which kind of did everything. Who was based perhaps at a crossroads, who would have perhaps 2 rooms set aside, or possibly only even one with a small grocery in the corner, and then distributing drinks in the other. And these then multiplied across the island of Ireland. They would have also been involved in 2 other very important activities, one of which was money lending, or acting as a source of local credit, and being involved in the purchase and sale of local agricultural produce of a variety of means. Some of these shops grew and developed and became what were called monster shops, or what we would maybe call a rural variety hardware, kind of selling everything that was a requirement. And others then would have perhaps targeted a more luxury clothing market. And again, historians refer to Hilliard's of Kilkenny and Morrissey's of Abbeyleix as shops which had really begun some of these early trends towards expansion. Hilliard's, for example, circulated its price list to about 10,000 people within a 30-mile radius of its premises. And Morrissey's of Abbeyleix specialized in importing luxury foodstuffs, which they then targeted at the local gentry class. So we can see these. I wanted to just, again, mention the significance of women in retail trade. And because this is a sector, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th century, which was open towards women's involvement. Now, most historians talk about the early modern period, the 17th and 18th century, as a time when production takes place in a domestic environment, and where families as a whole view production or engaging in business as a family activity. So everybody gets involved, and everybody takes part. And there weren't such clear and rigorous divisions between men and women. Everybody shared in the work, so that women would count themselves as shoemakers too, even though they might not actively be making the shoes. Over the course of the 19th century, it's harder and harder for middle-class women in particular to maintain their involvement in these sorts of family businesses. Nevertheless, what the research shows is that consistently women are present within the retail sector. I mean, I quote here Imelda Brophy's research, where she looked at 50 women who were involved in wholesale and craft trades in the Dublin Directory for 1800. And she looked at the whole gamut of their businesses. And what she found was that most of these women had been involved in the clothing and textile sector. They were seamstresses, they were linen printers, they were milliners, they were stay makers or bonnet makers. And that of these 50 businesses, 27 of them had never been owned by a man before. 22 of them had been previously owned by a man, most probably the woman's husband, and 1 had been previously owned by a woman. She then looked after 1800 to see what had happened to these businesses. 37 of the 50 stayed in female hands. 8 were taken over by men, and 5 were continued by other women. So again, you can see that none of these businesses are, so there's no trend away from female ownership. And towards the end, she points out that women formed an effective monopoly in the whole area of millinery, in hat making, and that in Dublin it was a significant business. So when we look at retail trade, we need to always remember that this is an area where we can see women operating, and hopefully I'll come back to that in one of my examples. Now, one of the problems is, as I've pointed out, is that in rural Ireland in the late 19th century, access to credit was difficult. And so not all of the shops were lovely and nice, full of wonderful things. There were very poor shops too, particularly in poorer areas of the West and in the North, where the economy was just that little bit poorer. And for many people, setting up a shop then was really easy. You didn't even really need a premises. And I'd just like to quote here from a book written by Horace Plunkett, who was an agricultural reformer of the sort of mid to late 19th century. And what he's describing here is a typical village shop which catered for poorer customers. He says, the houses, often, more correctly, hovels, have no additional accommodation for the business being carried on. Okay? So he's saying, they're making no allowances for their business. He said, if it were not for the few clay pipes lolling their heads against the window sashes as a sign that even luxuries are supplied, you would pass many a roadside house without knowing that you were leaving behind the emporium of a universal provider. If you go in, you may not be able to see for a while, but on the threshold, another sense reminds you that there is more than meets the eye. A delicate nose will at once detect the presence of tea, sugar, and tobacco in the turf-laden atmosphere. If you note dirty meal molding in rotten bins, a few loaves for those whose style of living demands scientifically whitened bread, a few jars of peppermint or sugar stick, and a heap somewhere of rapidly fermenting dried fruit, and then make an entry of sundries, you have made a fairly correct inventory in the market for the poor. So what Plunkett is saying, he's very critical of this, but what he's pointing to is clearly the shop for the very poor, and that for many people it was easy to set something like this up. They simply converted a part of their front room towards doing it. But the problem was that in many rural areas, even a shop like this could be the only sort of channel for trade and the only access to mass-produced goods. And this has given rise to the whole phenomenon of gombinism and the gombeen man. Now, the gombeen man is a small village shop owner who is said to have issued credit to local people at extortionate rates of interest. And the image then of the gombeen man in rural Ireland, which was then taken over by nationalists and all the rest, was one of extortion, charging high and excessive rates of interest, of engaging in a truck system where if you wanted to sell your products to him, then you had to buy from him as well. If you worked in the local area, you would have had to then, and this notion of tying people to a particular shop was meant to have been widespread. Now, economic historians have kind of looked at this and said that the gombeen system by the 1870s or 1880s was largely dying out. But that's not to say that the image or the impression wasn't. And it's not to say, too, that there weren't those who still operated along gombeen lines. For much of that was indeed the case. And this whole system of rural money lending and credit was the real target of agricultural reformers, who tried to promote a greater sort of sense of consumer education and in order to try and change things. But it was really the growth of literacy, people's ability to read, that brought much of the system to the end. For as the consumer got a bit smarter, so it was more difficult then for the gombeen man to exploit them. So, just to say sort of a final word then about shopping in the big towns and in the big cities. Because despite the falling population of the late 19th century, the size of towns and the proportion of the population of Ireland who lived in towns grew. By 1914, about 1/3 of the population of Ireland lived in a town that was larger than 1,500 people. This had been less than a sixth in 1845. So the Irish population, although still largely rural, was becoming a greater proportion were living in urban environments. And so of course the late 19th century then has a reputation for the growth of shops. And the censuses show the increase of proportions of those working in these sectors. So publicans, innkeepers, and grocers increase as a proportion of the population. Same to do shopkeepers and dealers. And it's now that you begin to get the emergence of the substantial department store. By 1914, Belfast had 5 large department stores, as well as a significant number of chain stores, which existed and had branches across the UK, and had a number of British firms operating here. This is Robinson and Cleaver, obviously, which was started in 1870. The building featured here, designed by the Belfast architects Young and Mackenzie, was designed and opened in 1888, and was then the height of luxury. And again, we need to just speculate then about the cultural impact of such a luxurious shopping environment on the people of Belfast. So what I was hoping to do then, with just the few minutes remaining, was just to look a bit at my little examples of Hill Street, Newry in sort of 1901, using the censuses largely, and then looking a bit at the Falls Road. Now, what I did for Hill Street was simply to look at the census returns for the shops on the street, and I kind of, just to give myself a spatial understanding of what the street was like, I just plotted out where everybody was. I just looked at every census return for the whole street, and then did a little bit of a statistical analysis. It's not particularly scientific. I'll come back to the diagram in a minute. But let's just look a bit at the numbers here. And so it enables you to get a comparison and to get a sense of what the character of a street could potentially be. So you can see that, and what has struck me about both the work that I did on Hill Street and on the Falls Road is how static the commercial sector is between 1901 and 1911. You don't really see a dramatic change over a 10-year period in the number of shops. Okay, and so sure enough, 31 shops in 1901 and 31 shops again in 1911. But what you can see does happen to Newry is that it gets a new town hall. So the emergence of the town itself and its civic presence changes, but not so much its commercial presence. And while the population falls slightly and the number of households fall, the rest of the I suppose character of the street stays pretty much the same. The other thing that changes, though, which again surprised me, was in fact that the street doesn't become more Catholic, as I would have anticipated, given Newry's character. The street actually becomes less. So of the Catholic households on the street, there were 10. This has fallen to 6. But do the Anglicans and the Presbyterians benefit? No, they don't. Instead, it is the emergence of minor Protestant denominations. So a Quaker household is established, a Quaker business is established, a Christian Brethren business is established, and possibly a Baptist as well, but I'm not sure about that. Which, and again, I think that's kind of interesting too. It says interesting thing about the fragmentation of Protestantism in the early 20s, potentially, right? What's interesting too is that if we go back to the diagram then, is the extent to which people live in above their shops. Right? Because all of the shops here are occupied, almost all of them are occupied by the owners. Some of them, for example, like here, this is a house that has 4 male shop assistants living in it. Presumably like a boarding house or a set of rooms that the young men were renting who lived nearby. But here in number 23, you've got Bernard Rice, who was a Catholic saddler, and his family, 5 of them altogether, living above their premises. Edward Sloane, 3 doors down, Church of Ireland, with a Catholic wife and a daughter, was a jeweler and a watchmaker. John and William Connor were Presbyterian. They ran a monster shop, I would suggest. They had 9 assistants and 2 servants helping them with their chemist's business. I wonder if it's Connor's Chemist, but I've never checked, alas. George Kinnear, however, down at this end of the street, I would say you see the older and fashioned shops. So here we have at number 35, Maggie and Lizzie Taylor, who are elderly Anglican spinsters running a small newsagent's. Or George Kinnear, who's a single grocer with a servant to help. So what strikes me too about this is that even if we have a sense of a town being a particular religious denomination, when you drill down to the local level, what you see is such a diversity of family arrangements and activity and religious groups that nobody seems to be operating according to any sort of general characteristics. So let's then just look very briefly at the Falls Road in 1901. And this is part of a bigger study of the Falls Road that I did, where we looked at the Falls Road itself, everything that fronted onto the Falls Road, and counted it all up. And then we looked at a number of Falls Road communities, just to get a sense of what the road was like. And what became clear, I guess, was that that the Falls Road was, unsurprisingly, a major shopping street, and it was a significant residential street as well, it was and also had significant amounts of industry. Now, I'm sort of scrounging around here, yes. So you can see, and again, I mean, we also were curious to understand to what extent the story that I've heard quite a lot, which is, oh, the Falls Road was very Protestant in the early 20th century. And so we decided we would count then the number of people who actually lived on the road itself. Okay, so this isn't the Falls Road community, this is just the census returns for the Falls Road for 1901 and 1911. And what you can see is that for both 1901 and 1911, about 22% of the Falls Road population was Protestant, and the remainder then was Catholic. And this would probably reflect the fact that at the bottom end of the Falls Road there was still the Falls Road Methodist Church, and that the whole area around Broadway was still very much a Protestant area, and Broadway Presbyterian Church was still ministering to that community. But really, for many other, I suppose it also points to the fact that really much beyond Broadway, the Falls Road was still largely unpopulated, or populated really by middle-class sort of suburbia living, which was again predominantly Protestant. If you look down towards the other end of the falls, towards the town end, of course, down there, it was almost exclusively Catholic in composition. But the other thing then that we discovered was that was that we looked at the, so first of all, then I should say, was that we looked at the street directories. And again, the street directories are fantastic. But what we did was we took the street directories and then we compared them to the census. So this is the street directory, part of it for the Falls Road for 1900. And we compared the entries up against the census returns for each of the businesses to see whether or not they matched. Because as you can see, well, you can't see there, but I'll blow it up a little bit bigger. Okay? As you can see, next to each individual's name, it says, for example, number 46, Kelly, John, publican. Number 48, Hodgson, E, draper. But it's not really clear from the directory whether or not that's a commercial premises and a shop, or whether or not it's a residence and a home. But if you look at the census, and you use in particular form B1, it identifies and helps you to identify that for you. Okay? So the form B1s, which are attached to the household forms, will show you, will tell you. Because down here, after the column which refers to the status of the building, if it's built or under construction, it tells you what the building is, what its purpose is. So you can see, it starts out at the top, it says public house, shop, 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 public house, shop, 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 and then down here, private dwelling, shop, shop, pawn office. And this column, and the detail that's provided here entirely depends on the census enumerator. Some census enumerators were far more willing to include specific details about the nature of certain buildings, and others weren't. So it's really just the luck of the draw as to what you get. But what is really significant actually is the next column along, because it then asks in this column here, is this premises inhabited? So that tells you whether or not the shop is actually used as a residence, or whether or not it's used simply as a commercial premises. And so what we did then for the Falls Road was to calculate to what extent shops were occupied during this period. And what we discovered was that about 65 to 70% of the shops on the Falls Road between 1901 and 1911 were occupied by their owners. The majority then of people on the Falls who ran businesses used them also as their residential spaces. And in fact, the trend between 1901 and 1911 was to increase that statistic. So, of the 114 shops on the Falls Road in 1901, 73 were residences. Of 110 shops in 1911, 79 were residences. So that's about a 64% and sort of a 71% occupancy rate, which is kind of interesting, which I think is really kind of interesting, and to see how much, in fact, that has actually changed since this time. But what I wanted to do is just to kind of end with, because you could just, so to end with just very quickly then, just wanting to look at the Crilly family in particular. So what we did was we looked at one small section of the road and at those particular census returns to see what they could tell us a bit. And I found the Crilly family here, who are at, you can see on the far right hand side, the number on Form B is 86. This is 1901. Oh, sorry. So if we just scroll back then, in 1901 you can see 86 is listed as a shop. Yes, it's inhabited. It's a second class building, and there's John Crilly, okay, our head of house. Now let's scoot back then to his census return. Because what's really interesting is that John Crilly's listed as the head of house, but his occupation is a flax rougher. Okay? His wife is then returned as a housekeeper. His son is a flax dresser, and another one is a clerk. His two daughters then are shop assistants. And then he's got his youngest daughter is at school. So what's going on in their household? How is that household operating? I wasn't really sure. And so then I got the census return out for the following year. And here's the household then 10 years later. Ellen Crilly is now the head of house, and she's listed as a newsagent. All right, and then her two daughters are listed here, and they are, you can't really read it, but it says like shop assistants or shop girls. And she's also then got Lily Larkin, I think, who is a boarder, but also a shop assistant. So what's really so what has happened here? Or what's kind of operating? Okay, so Ellen Crilly in 1901 is only a housekeeper, but by 1911 she's a newsagent. They've always lived in that place. So I'm wondering if they would the daughters I'm assuming that the husband goes out to work in the local mill. He's a flax rougher, highly skilled, highly paid role within the linen industry. And maybe two of his daughters work in the shop downstairs. He dies for whatever reason, so does Ellen Crilly then take over the shop and then begin to run it with her daughters? Had they always run it alongside the business? Had she been, in fact, in charge of the shop in 1901, but is simply recorded as being a housekeeper rather than being a shopkeeper? I think it's really interesting to see this kind of sort of family environment, if you will, where it's likely that there were perhaps two or possibly even more incomes coming into that family unit before John Crilly died. We haven't talked, unfortunately, too much about the other ways you can get at the experience of shop and shop life. There are a number of accounts of people that have written down what it was like to live in a shop or run shops. And I would certainly recommend Fred McGinley's memoirs, again of the Falls Road, where he grew up. He eventually moved into the electrical trade and set up his own business. And his memoir is here in PRONI, and you can have a look at that. Michael McClaverty, again, in Lost Fields, talks about the whole idea, the whole business of shopping quite extensively in his book, Lost Fields. And there are probably, for your area, many people who reminisce about the shops of their youth in your local library. I would certainly recommend that you would give all of those a try. So I'm kind of just going to end on a rather kind of a, that's it really. Good luck with your research. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.